Prudent Scholars in association with Goa Headmasters Association.
Hi students, today we are going to read and understand the story, A Triumph of Surgery, from your supplementary reader, Footprints Without Feet. This story is about a pet. Now children, adopting or keeping a pet is a commitment. It is a major, great responsibility. Pets as young babies like puppies and kittens are very adorable, but at the same time, as they grow up, just love and affection is not enough. You have to take much more responsibility, like vaccinations, regular visit to the vet, then you have to look about its diet, health, hygiene, cleanliness, grooming, and much more. Pets are also therapy. Many a times, pets are now recently used as therapy, especially for people, children, elders who need to cope with physical, emotional stress. They are also wonderful companions to people who are lonely. So this story is about a pet. The pet is Tricky. So shall we move on? So Triumph of Surgery is about a pet dog Tricky who is overfed and overpampered by his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, who is a rich old lady. She feeds him so much to such an extent that he falls seriously ill, and she has to consult Dr. Harriet, her veterinary surgeon. And Dr. Harriet intervenes at the right time and decides to take Tricky under his personal care. So now this story, A Triumph of Surgery, is written by Dr. James Harriet, who was a British veterinary surgeon and also an author. So children, you will find here the story is written in the first person, that is I. So I here refers to Dr. James Harriet. So now, shall we move on to the story, A Triumph of Surgery? I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage, with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So when Dr. Harriet saw Tricky, he was disturbed by Tricky's appearance because Tricky looked totally unhealthy. His eyes were watery, bloodshot, and he couldn't walk properly. His tongue was hanging loosely out from his mouth. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So, I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So Mrs. Pumphrey, instead of helping, she was worsening the situation by giving Tricky some extras between meals. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak that I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolates so I can't bear to refuse him. Mrs. Pumphrey is a very soft and kind lady. So she feeds Tricky more and more. She just can't refuse to say no to Tricky. So she keeps feeding him things that she should not be feeding, like cakes and chocolates. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. So, Dr. Harriet knows that Tricky is an extremely greedy dog. He can eat anything at any time of the day. He cannot refuse food. That's his major problem. And so, Mrs. Pumphrey keeps feeding him. And there are many things probably that she hasn't even mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see. But Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. So one more problem here is that Tricky has no exercise, just the little walks that he takes with Mrs. Pumphrey. And she probably is old and frail, so the walks are limited. The gardener Hodgkin is down with lumbago. Lumbago is a muscular pain in the lower back. So there is no ring throwing, so no exercise, and this is the major cause for Tricky's problem. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So Mr. Harriet tried to sound very firm and very severe, so he told her that you have to cut down on Tricky's food right now, otherwise this will worsen the problem. And Mrs. Pumphrey decided to put the new system, the new regime, his new diet, Tricky's new diet into practice. Though I'm sure she found it very, very difficult because she's a very soft and gentle lady. Some important points, students, before we move on. Why was Dr. Harriet worried about Tricky? Tricky looked extremely unhealthy. He looked bloated. His eyes were bloodshot and he couldn't walk steadily. So Dr. Harriet, as a veterinary surgeon, a doctor for animals, he is totally worried about Tricky's condition. And what were the reasons? Why was Tricky unhealthy? Tricky basically was a greedy dog. He ate any time of the day. Any time was good time. Mrs. Pumphrey did not follow Dr. Harriet's advice on Tricky's diet. This was another problem. On the contrary, she overfed Tricky, thinking he was suffering from malnutrition. The third thing is Tricky had no exercise, and Hodgkin, the gardener, was down with lumbago. So Tricky was practically without any exercise. So these were all the problems, and this is the reason why Tricky was unhealthy. So let's move on to the next part. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. Tottering is moving unsteadily. He couldn't walk properly. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats. For the cold weather, a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So Dr. Harriet observes Tricky, and Tricky belongs to a rich mistress, so he has different coats for different weather, but he cannot walk properly because of his ill health. And Dr. Harriet knows that it won't be long before he will get a call from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. She was extremely worried about Tricky. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. This is Tricky's condition. He was totally sick. He couldn't do anything. He was suffering from bouts of vomiting. He had spells of vomiting. He would refuse his favorite food. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. So Dr. Harriet is a very proficient doctor and he knows exactly what is to be done. He knows that if he lets Tricky be with Mrs. Pumphrey, the problem will never be solved. So he decides to take Tricky away from her house. So he says that Tricky should be hospitalized for at least a fortnight, that is 2 weeks. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. So Mrs. Pumphrey almost fainted. She felt that Tricky could not live without her. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So Dr. Harriet felt that he had to be very, very strict and very firm. So without listening to Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings or crying, he just took the dog, marched out to the car, carried the dog wrapped in a blanket. The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all this stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So Tricky had a whole lot of dog accessories like lunch bowls, breakfast bowls, supper bowls, cushions, toys. He belongs to a rich mistress. And the maids were trying to stuff everything in Dr. Harriet's car. But Dr. Harriet knew that Tricky would need nothing. So he drove away quickly. And the entire household, the servants, the staff, the maids, all are in tears because Tricky is a very loved and pampered dog in Mrs. Pumphrey's household. He is like a family member. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. So when Dr. Harriet glanced at Tricky, he realized that Tricky was totally listless. He had no energy in him. He could not even wag his tail properly. But Dr. Harriet assured him that I know a cure for you. So he does have a cure for Tricky. Before we move on, let's just check the important points that we have discussed. Why did Mrs. Pumphrey call Dr. Harriet? Mrs. Pumphrey was extremely worried as Tricky refused food. He had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time on a rug panting and didn't want to go out for walks. And what was Dr. Harriet's plan? Dr. Harriet planned to take Tricky to his surgery for at least a fortnight, for at least 2 weeks, without any delay. How did Mrs. Pumphrey and her staff react to Dr. Harriet's plan? Mrs. Pumphrey almost fainted when she heard of his plan because she believed that she and Tricky could never live without each other. The entire staff was roused. They rushed to gather Tricky's beds, cushions, bowls and other belongings. Everybody was in tears because Tricky, a beloved member of Mrs. Pumphrey's household, would be away for at least a fortnight. Okay, children, So this is where Tricky is taken away for a fortnight by Dr. Harriet. This is a part of Dr. Harriet's plan. So shall we move on? At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So when Dr. Harriet reached the surgery, the other dogs, the household dogs, surged around him, gushed around him, and when they see a new object, usually dogs come and sniff, and later on leave you alone because that interest in the new person is gone. So the same thing they did with Tricky. They sniffed around him, and after they found that he was uninteresting, they ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So Tricky was given nothing for 2 days, only plenty of water and no food. But Dr. Harriet kept him under observation. He was constantly keeping an eye on Tricky's progress. Slowly, Tricky started to show some interest in his surroundings. And on the third day, he made some soft sounds, whimpers, when he heard the dogs in the yard. So probably he wanted to move out. He wanted to go out and play with the other dogs. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe the greyhound and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. So as soon as Dr. Harriet opened the door, Tricky trotted out. Still, he is not totally recovered. He moves out slowly, and immediately the other dogs come around him. The greyhound Joe engulfs him. He is swept over by them, tramped over, rolled over, and then the dogs move off. But Tricky cannot move quickly with his surplus fat. He is huge and bloated. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by sounds of high-speed eating. So, Dr. Harriet was there when Tristan, his companion or his staff member, was serving food to the dogs. And the dogs just rush to eat. There's high-speed eating, the lapping sound. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of the meal. So the dogs had to finish off their meal, otherwise the others would come and eat it. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. So now Tricky is showing some interest in food. Again, his appetite is developing for food. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So next day, Dr. Harriet put out an extra bowl for Tricky, and he was happy to see that Tricky pushed his way towards his bowl. From then on, his progress was rapid. From then on, Tricky made rapid progress. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages, in their friendly fights. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang. So Tricky was accepted by the rest of the dogs and he became a part of the gang, playing with them, tramping over them, being bowled over, being squashed every few minutes. An unlikely silky little object among the shaggy crew. So Tricky is different from the other dogs because he's silky and he's shiny and the rest are shaggy, unkempt dogs. And he was fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So Tricky had never experienced this in Mrs. Pumphrey's household ever. He had never hunted for rats. He didn't have any companions. He didn't have any friends. So this was a total change for Tricky. Before we move on, let's check on some important points that we have dealt so far. So how did Dr. Harriet treat Tricky at the surgery? For the first 2 days, Dr. Harriet gave Tricky only plenty of water and no food. He made up a bed for Tricky in a warm, loose box. After Tricky showed some interest in food, an extra bowl was kept for him. He observed Tricky closely, but did not give him any special medicinal treatment. And how was Tricky's life at the surgery different from his life at Mrs. Pumphrey's house? At the surgery, Tricky lived among other dogs, whereas at Mrs. Pumphrey's house, he lived all alone. He didn't have any companions. He became an accepted member of the gang of dogs. He was tramped on, bowled over, and squashed by other dogs. He learned to jostle and fight for his share of food. He hunted for rats at night, which he probably would have never done in Mrs. Pumphrey's house. He never had such a joyful time in his life. So these are the differences in Tricky's life at the surgery and Tricky's life at Mrs. Pumphrey's house. So let's move on. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. So Mrs. Pumphrey is very concerned. She's very caring and kind. So she keeps calling. She's anxious about Tricky's health. So she keeps calling up Dr. Harriet, inquiring about Tricky's health, his progress. And Dr. Harriet has to tell her that Tricky is better now. He is regaining health, recovering. Convalescing means recovering. And he's out of danger. But he does not listen to her questions and avoids the questions about the cushions and the coats because he has used none of those belongings. He has neither used any coats, nor any cushions, nor any bowls. So he avoids those questions conveniently. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring around fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. So the minute Mrs. Pumphrey heard that Tricky was recovering, she started to send eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build Tricky's strength. And these eggs were never served to Tricky, but Dr. Harriet and his partners relished the eggs at breakfast. But she started sending bottles of wine. This was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now Tricky didn't need wine, so Dr. Harriet and his partners enjoyed the wine Lunch was a ceremony to them. So glasses of wine between the meals, before the meals. So he and his partners were having a very good time. This shows Dr. Harriot's humor and wit when he writes this. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. So Dr. Harriot says that they couldn't believe it when she started sending brandy to help Tricky's constitution, Tricky's body structure, and they enjoyed the brandy at night, inhaled it, and drunk the brandy with great respect, reverently. This talks about Dr. Harriot's humor. When he writes it, you know that he's a very witty and humorous person. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously around the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, felt compelled to phone and tell her that the dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. So Dr. Harriot says that he was tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest because then the eggs, the wine, the brandy would keep coming and they could enjoy it. But he knew very well and he had a conscience that Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering without Tricky. So he was forced to call her up and tell her that the dog was totally fine now and she could come and collect it. She could come and take Tricky home. So before we move on, let's check on the points that we've learned so far. What was Mrs. Pumphrey's condition when Tricky arrived at the surgery? Mrs. Pumphrey missed Tricky. She was worried about him. She called up Dr. Harriot a dozen times a day to inquire about Tricky's health. The news that Tricky was out of danger and was recovering made her very happy. She started to send eggs, wine and brandy for Tricky. She's such a generous woman. She starts to send eggs, wine and even expensive brandy. Why was Dr. Harriot tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest? The eggs, wine and brandy which Mrs. Pumphrey was sending to build up Tricky's strength were actually relished by Dr. Harriot and his partners. They had extra eggs for breakfast and a ceremonial lunch with wine. Dr. Harriot was tempted to keep Tricky permanently so that they could continue to enjoy such a hearty breakfast and such good meals. Okay? So let's move on to the last part of this lesson. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." So 30 feet of gleaming black metal is the luxurious huge car like a limousine. And she is rich. The chauffeur is a private driver. The chauffeur opened the door and Mrs. Pumphrey, tiny little frail little woman, lost in the interior of the car. But she's so concerned about Tricky and she really doesn't believe that Tricky is well. So she asks Dr. Harriot, "Do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" Dr. Harriot assures her, yes, and he will get the dog. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn. And in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. So there was a great transformation in Tricky within 2 weeks. See, after exercise and a proper diet, Tricky had become lithe. Lithe is toned and flexible. He could run very fast. He was keeping up well with the pack. So earlier he was tottering, walking unsteadily. He could not keep up with the other dogs, but now he was full of energy and he could well keep up with the pack. Stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "ooh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So when Dr. Harriet got Tricky out, he just jumped from his arms into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap and started licking her. So this shows that Tricky, though he had an enjoyable time at the surgery, he was extremely happy to see his mistress because he loved her. And he started licking her, he swarmed over her, barking, wagging his tail probably. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So, when Mrs. Pumphrey and Tricky were united, Dr. Harriet helped the chauffeur to bring out all the belongings of Tricky which were never used, the toys, the cushions, the bowls. And Mrs. Pumphrey was so emotional and she thanked Dr. Harriet and she said, "This is a triumph of surgery." Now, triumph is victory and surgery has two meanings. One is treatment with the help of instruments, that is like an operation, and surgery also means a place where a doctor advises or treats his patients. So she feels that Tricky has gone through a major surgery and that is why he has recovered. She is very gullible and naive. So let's check out some important points here. How was Tricky transformed at the surgery? In 2 weeks' time, Tricky was transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. So he was flexible, well-toned. He was keeping up well with the other dogs, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. Why does Mrs. Pumphrey call Tricky's recovery a triumph of surgery? Dr. Harriet knows what Tricky suffers from and does not give Tricky any special medicinal treatment, but just plenty of water and exercise which Tricky needs. Many a times, all that we need is just water and exercise to keep us healthy if we overeat and if we are sick. However, Mrs. Pumphrey is not aware of Dr. Harriet's treatment. She believes that Tricky has undergone some surgery which has cured him and hence terms his transformation as a triumph of surgery. Well, students, before we wind up, some important tips when you do a supplementary lesson. When you read a lesson from the supplementary reader, read the entire story first and enjoy it. Reading is for enjoyment. So first thing that you do is read the entire story and enjoy it. Then, note down the important characters in the story. For example, now in this story you had 3 major characters, Mrs. Pumphrey, Dr. Harriet, and Tricky here is treated like a human because the entire story revolves around Tricky. So there are 3 major characters. Write down the character sketch to have a strong mental image of the person. For example, when you talk about Mrs. Pumphrey, she's rich, she's old and frail, she's kind, generous, compassionate, caring, a bit naive and gullible, foolishly indulgent, probably very lonely. Some characteristics you will get from the lesson itself, and some you might have to infer from the behavior. For example, frail you know because she had little walks, generous, compassionate, caring because she loved, tricky and she was worried about him, she cared for him, she called Dr. Harriet a dozen times a day to inquire about his progress. She was foolishly indulgent. In spite of knowing Tricky's problem, she kept feeding him. She kept giving him sweets and cakes which she should not. She was probably lonely, and so Tricky was her only companion. So these are the traits of a person, and you should write these traits down. For example, if you take Dr. Harriet, Dr. Harriet is intelligent, proficient doctor, he's very tactful, he's witty at the same time, he knows how to treat his patients. So these are all the traits that come out, or traits that you can infer. The last thing that you can do is, after you read the entire story, write the story summary in a nutshell, just points in a nutshell, and so when you do it again, it's easy for you to remember. With that, I end this session on a story, The Triumph of Surgery. I hope you've enjoyed this session, children. Happy learning.